Muhammad wa al Muhammad. We're now going to start the main talk, start the program today with a recitation of Quran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نون والقلم وما يسترون ما أنت بنعمة ربك بمجنون وإن لك لأجرا غير ممنون وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم فستبصر ويبصرون بأيكم المفتون إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين فلا تطع المكذبين ودوا لو تدهنوا فيدهنون ولا تطع كل حلاف مهين هماز مشاء بنميم مناع للخير معتد أثيم أتل بعد ذلك زنيم أن كان ذا مال وبنين إذا تتلى عليه آياتنا قال أساطير الأولين سنسمه على الخرطوم إنا بلوناهم كما بلونا أصحاب الجنة إذ أقسموا ليصرمنها مصبحين ولا يستثنون فطاف عليها طائف من ربك وهم نائمون فأصبحت كالصريم فتنادوا مصبحين أن اغدوا على حرثكم إن كنتم صارمين فانطلقوا وهم يتخافتون ألا يدخلنها اليوم عليكم مسكين وغدوا على حرد قادرين صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Today we're very fortunate to have Shaykh Arek Miernik, who will be speaking to us on anchoring Islam in the Western cultural experience, the role of scholars of convert background. Let's welcome Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Shaykh Arek is a teacher, a translator and of many books and many Shia books into Polish. He has translated Nahj al-Balagha, Risal al-Huquq and Sayf al-Sajjadiyya into Polish. In addition, he graduated from Al-Ahmadi Institute a long time ago and also completed a master's more recently. We're very fortunate to have him today speaking on this topic. Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا بقاسم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين والمعصومين أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for having me. It's the first time I've ever been to this particular center. And every time I visit any mosque or center for the first time, I'm always reminded of a story my friend once told me. And it kind of fits in what I want to talk about tonight. So let me share it with you. So a friend of mine from a Catholic background, who's a convert, has visited a Shia mosque or any mosque for the very first time in his life. So at that point, he was a very recent convert, and he went for Jummah. It was his very first visit, and after the prayers, he saw someone kind of walking up and down rows of people with a little basket, and from the distance, he saw people putting something in that basket. And of course, it was someone just being helpful and collecting turbas. But the friend of mine, being from a Catholic background, immediately associated that with something that he was used to seeing in the Catholic Church. So after every church service, again, someone walks up and down rows of people with a little basket. But of course, what they're doing is they're collecting donations. So my friend, seeing that, just instinctively took out his wallet, and he was actually trying to put some money into a box of turbas before he kind of realized what was going on, and causing quite a bit of confusion and quite a bit of embarrassment to himself. But yeah, he survived. He has a funny story to tell. But yeah, that's what happens when us as converts, and I am one myself, when we come into any community, we of course come with a particular set of cultural assumptions, right, that we have kind of inherited from our cultures. And of course, we very quickly realize that most of the communities and most centers are very deeply rooted in a particular culture as well, which is usually associated with a particular ethnicity or a particular region that community kind of originally comes from. So after sort of reading about Islam, after kind of learning the basics, we go to a mosque and we quickly realize that, well, Islam is never just Islam. Islam is usually understood and practiced in a very particular way. It's always practiced within a kind of particular system of customs and habits and cultural sort of assumptions, etc. Right? And of course, we know that the reason for that is that historically Islam has been very good at kind of adapting itself culturally, right? So with the historic spread of Islam, wherever Islam went, it very quickly sort of absorbed a lot of the local culture, and that was one of the reasons for kind of successful spread of it. And it was very good at sort of creating a localized version of Islam, so to speak, right? Wherein there will always be kind of the core message and the core practices and rituals, which are always sort of the same everywhere, but Islam would sort of create sort of a cultural superstructure around it. And there's many examples of that. I mean, I'm sure anyone of us who've traveled through different Muslim countries have seen these kind of local flavors and localized versions of Islam, whether that's so in Bosnia or Indonesia or China, right? And China is actually a particularly good example of that. Even looking at sort of Chinese mosques, you see this very kind of Chinese architecture. They look like pagodas, basically. You could easily mistake a Chinese mosque for a Buddhist temple, right? And Chinese Muslims kind of developed their own styles of Kung Fu and Tai Chi. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Right? I remember speaking to Haji Nuruddin, who's a quite well-known Chinese Muslim calligrapher. And I spoke to him about the Muslim version of Tai Chi. And he would actually show me how Muslims would kind of take the very kind of familiar movements that we sort of associate with Tai Chi, and they would Islamize them, and they would change them into this sort of like a dua motion, right? I found it absolutely fascinating, right? And that they kind of took that on. They didn't just say, well, we'll just leave that aside, there's Quran doesn't say anything about Tai Chi, right? But no, they've kind of appropriated it. They made it into something that culturally kind of works for them, but at the same time creating something that the wider Chinese society is kind of familiar with, right? That helps the wider Chinese society look at Chinese Islam as something that's not too alien or foreign. Now, in terms of Islam in the West, or in most places in the West, that's not the kind of historical pattern that Islam sort of emerged here, right? So Islam didn't sort of organically grow for sort of hundreds of years. Obviously, it came mostly with migration of Muslims to Western countries, and so we have a situation where those kind of localized Islams that kind of developed in a very particular set of circumstances, often reflecting a particular historical experience, they now came to the UK or any or the European country and were almost sort of transplanted here as a kind of ready-made product. Right? They didn't develop organically for centuries as they did elsewhere. And that kind of strong identification of particular communities with particular cultures seem to be sort of perpetuated even in kind of subsequent generations. And sometimes it just occurs naturally. Sometimes there are factors that even kind of help that along. For example, we know that still many communities would kind of bring over imams from well, back home, wherever home is. And of course, that's absolutely fine. Right? I think the starting point of any sort of discussion on sort of Islam and culture is that it is everyone's right to understand and practice Islam within whatever culture they feel a connection to. Right? But at the same time, we do have to admit that that does have some consequences. Right? It has consequences sort of individually for any outsider who wants to come into that community, whether that's a convert or a Muslim from just a different Muslim community. It also has consequences for people, and that's probably a lot more important, for people from within that communities who might not have that kind of deep connection to the culture of whatever the culture of origin in that community is. And that often happens in the second or third generation. But that also happens to people from sort of mixed cultural backgrounds. Right? And we know that in the second, kind of a third generations, people start asking different questions. People have, sort of different aspirations. People have different opportunities, right? And a lot of them no longer see the back home as their actual home. Perhaps they never even been there. So, and finally, I think this kind of perpetuation of that association of particular mosque with a particular culture also has consequences for Islam in that particular country as a whole, right? Because that raises a question, what does that mean in terms of the kind of growth of Islam in that country, right? Is it able to attract people? Right? What's the perception of it? Is it just seen as something completely foreign? Right? And having been involved for many years in sort of introducing people to Islam, right? As you've heard, I originally come from Poland, and I'm still very much involved in sort of tabligh activities there. It's obviously a Muslim country, a non-Muslim country. Inshallah. So I've been involved in promoting Islam in Poland for, well, over 20 years. And in that time, I helped facilitate quite a few conversions. And what I found was that it's actually one of the biggest sort of obstacles in people kind of opening up to Islam more, is that perception they have that, well, it's something foreign, right? It's an immigrant religion, right? And most of the time they don't even mean it in any sort of racist way, but they just kind of ask themselves a question like, how would I fit into it, right? So even people who do have some interest in, or the teachings of Islam do seem to have sort of an initial appeal to them, it usually is that kind of stumbling block, right? That's usually what stops them from kind of going that step further. They just don't see themselves kind of belonging in a very kind of cultural community. And a similar thing happens with many people who do actually convert, and then they start attending their local center, right? And over time, quite a good number of them start feeling as if they don't necessarily belong. They might start drifting away, or sometimes it might even happen that people there kind of try to sort of mold them in that particular cultural fashion. I'll give you an interesting example of someone whose story kind of actually touched me when I've heard it. There's an American skateboarder. He's called Jordan Richter. And in the 1990s, he was a very up-and-coming sort of rising star of the skateboarding world. He turned into a professional skateboarder at the age of 16, and he was really expected to kind of take this sport into like new heights. And then he disappeared. And what happened was he converted to Islam, and he started attending his local mosque, and the community there started sort of pressuring him into quitting skateboarding, basically convincing him that this entire skateboarding sort of culture and lifestyle and making money of it is something not befitting of a Muslim. And so he quit. And about 15 years later, when he sort of took it up again and started speaking about it publicly, when you hear him speak, he's got a lot of kind of resentment and anger, right? He was very disillusioned, very kind of bitter about the community that sort of made him stop. Because if you look at it, he had to give up not just a potentially lucrative career and an opportunity to make a living doing something he absolutely loved, but more importantly, he had to give up a passion and what he saw as a God-given talent. So he had to give up something hugely important to him just because it didn't fit in his Muslim community's very cultural vision of what a Muslim should be. And these sort of stories, they're not rare. I've heard quite a few of them personally. And so because of that, because of these sort of experiences, an idea appeared, right? So some converts started floating around the idea of indigenizing Islam, right? And what do they mean by that? I know that when I kind of first proposed the title of this talk as Indigenizing Islam, there was some question as to what does it actually mean. And I actually prefer a different term. Indigenizing Islam is the one that gets used a lot, but my kind of preferred term would be localizing Islam. And it comes from translation studies, actually. So in translation, there's two different ways of translating a text. There's just a straightforward translation, when you take a source text and you just convey its meaning into a target language. And there's localization, localizing a text. And that means that you translate it in a way that you actually tweak some things about it to make the text more understandable and more relatable to the target audience. Right? So for example, if you were to translate the expression, his daily bread, or your daily bread. If you were to translate that expression into a language of a country where they don't even have the concept of bread being like a staple sort of product that they daily eat, then they wouldn't really understand it. So you would have to tweak it and either use whatever food is their sort of staple, or use whatever expression they use to sort of express that idea of well, a daily bread. And yeah, so some convert groups started floating around this idea of localizing Islam, right? They basically asked the question, okay, so if historically that's the way Islam kind of spread into all these countries, right, where it sort of adopted very easily all these local cultures, then why can't we do that here in the West, right? Or in a particular country, right? Why can't we have an American Islam or British Islam, right? And there were several kind of groups, there are several groups kind of floating this idea around. I want to kind of briefly look into one of them, but there are more. Like for example, quite a prominent group doing precisely that is the group led by Imam Warithuddin Muhammad in America. And so he's the person who kind of led the mass conversion of the members of the Nation of Islam, which is sort of a black supremacist organization, into mainstream Sunni Islam. And part of that project that he led was also to make that Sunni Islam sort of rooted in the black American experience, right? So there are groups like that, but the one I would like to speak to you about today is a kind of loose network of scholars in the Sunni kind of tradition who are usually kind of collectively referred to as neo-traditionalists. And they so they are basically a group of kind of very loose network of kind of mostly converts who have converted to Islam in the 1960s in the era of kind of hippie counterculture, and then they spent some time in the Muslim world pursuing their advanced Islamic studies, and then they came back to the West and started teaching Islam and started forming communities, and they've opened quite a few pretty influential institutions, right? And so they started articulating Islam in a way that kind of addressed that issue of how do we sort of localize it, right? So just to give you some names, I think at least one you might be familiar with because I know he's actually been here once, and that's Shaykh Abdalhakim Murad. He's from Cambridge Muslim College. Another prominent figure in that sort of network is Shaykh Hamza Yusuf in America, quite a well-known figure. But there are others. There's, for example, Shaykh Umar Farooq Abdallah, and other figures that are kind of maybe less known. But they started establishing those institutions, and they started really attracting quite a bit of following amongst sort of broad spectrum of people, right? And the reason I actually wanted to speak about them in particular, because they actually appeal to all these groups that I've sort of mentioned. So they really appeal to converts, they really appeal to sort of second and third generations of people who do not necessarily feel that connected to the sort of cultures of their parents or grandparents anymore. And then they kind of produced a next generation of students who, again, opened their own institutions. They became scholars in their own right. So there were people like, for example, Yahya Rodas. He has his own kind of Islamic institute now, and quite significantly, someone by the name of Osama Khanan, who's sadly passed away, I think, a couple of years ago. But he has established something called the Ta'lif Collective, and that's particularly kind of significant to this topic because that's an organization that has precisely focused on trying to get together all these misfits, if you like, people who don't kind of necessarily entirely belong in their kind of traditional communities. So converts, people of mixed backgrounds, second and third generation Muslims. And they kind of provided them with this deculturalized space, if you like. And yeah, so what they do is they basically ask the question, can we not do the same thing that, say, Chinese Muslims did, right? Why can't we do that in the West? Is there something unique about the West that would prevent this? Or is there something unique about the historical relations between the Muslim world and the Western world that would prevent this, right? And by the way, we know, of course, that for most of Islam's history, scholars and fuqaha, both Sunni and Shia, actually believe that it's just impermissible to actually migrate into non-Muslim lands, right? So despite the fact that, well, in the Quran we do find verses that do seem to see migration in general as something quite positive, right? I mean, siru fil ard, travel through the earth, etc. But once the Islamic polity was established, it was then assumed that, okay, there's no longer any persecution. From now on, Muslims should just live in Muslim lands, and it would only be permissible to migrate into a non-Muslim country for very exceptional reasons, and even then, it shouldn't really be permanent. And by the way, when kind of classical Muslim scholars talked about these non-Muslim lands, they primarily meant what was then called Christendom and what kind of evolved into what we today refer to as the West, right? And it was only in the 20th century, really, with mass kind of migration of Muslims, that fiqh sort of caught up a little bit, and so it is now deemed permissible, of course, to migrate. But even now, if you read the writings of scholars regarding this topic, including some of our Maraji who have written about this, there's a sense of that these writings are really dominated by a very kind of precautionary tone, where it is kind of advised that these Muslims who migrate to the West should always be vigilant about the possibility of losing their faith or their iman getting weak. And on one hand, of course, that's perfectly understandable. Right? Concern for people's iman is perfectly understandable. But on the other hand, I think it raises the question: what does that mean for Western Muslims if they have to kind of treat the West or their circumstances that they live in as something kind of inherently dangerous to their faith? So I'm not sure what that kind of does in terms of sort of sense of belonging, right? But in any case, back to our network of the neo-traditionalist scholars. I would perhaps like to just focus a little bit on what I think actually makes them quite successful, and they are quite successful in attracting this following of these misfits, if you like, right? So converts and those people who don't kind of fit in to their communities. So the very first thing is the fact that they kind of locate their sort of Sunnism or their Islamic tradition within the very kind of intellectual history of Islam, right? So kind of deep intellectual kalami and fiqhi and ethical debates, which allows them to kind of present Islam as something very rich intellectually, something very rich artistically even, and something that has kind of deep humanistic elements within the tradition. So in any way, something that really kind of appeals to the sort of Western expectation of what religion is, probably more than maybe a more kind of rigid and literalist kind of reading of Islam, right? So they are able to present Islam in a way that really kind of appeals to the very rationalist mind. The second thing is that they are actually very well versed in not just the Islamic tradition, but the Western intellectual tradition, Western philosophical tradition. And the way they are able to kind of put these two together and in a dialogue is actually quite impressive. Right? If you listen to some of their lectures, I mean, verses of the Quran and quotes from Al-Ghazali sort of intertwined with Western thinkers and philosophers and political thinkers, etc. It's really quite impressive the way they do it. Another thing is the fact that they are actually quite critical of many aspects of Western modernity. Right? So they're not sort of just Western apologists, if you like, but they do criticize a lot of aspects of Western modernity, but not from a position of kind of rejection of the West, or not from a position of any sort of cultural resistance to the West, but from a position of people who are deeply connected to the West, but are just troubled with things like materialism, secularism, and all the kind of social ills that often kind of come with them. Another thing is that they are able to strike a really kind of interesting balance between that sort of rationality and the teachings that kind of they draw from Sufism, right, or Islamic mysticism, right? But they do it in a way that they don't really kind of venture out into the sort of controversial sort of Sufism, right? And they don't really associate themselves openly with kind of Sufi tariqas, right? They just sort of imbue their general message with kind of just enough spirituality, right, to strike a very kind of nice and very appealing balance. And finally, they really kind of emphasize on the sort of allegiance to what we would call an orthodox tradition, right? So they are not in any way kind of reformist, or they're not revisionist. They do not call for any reform in Islam, right? Even though they would like a kind of cultural adaptation, they do not kind of propose any actual changes in sort of Islam itself, which of course allows them to still tap into that kind of legitimacy that comes with tradition. And so this whole package, this whole kind of nice balance that they sort of struck in their kind of message, is one that is actually quite successful in sort of not just attracting converts, but re-engaging all those people who kind of got a little bit disengaged from their communities. So, I mean, it all sounds well and good, but I think let's problematize it a little bit, right? So the very first problem that I see with it is the fact that, well, there's a fundamental question. What is Western culture anyway? Right? And many people would kind of like us to believe that there's a very simple answer to that. So they would either give us a list of sort of progressive liberal values, right, for example, right? But then people who are more on the kind of conservative spectrum would obviously object and say, well, no, we're actually as Western, if not more, than you. And then someone else might come in and say, well, actually, Western culture is a legacy of racism and colonialism and slavery, etc. Right? So some might say that, well, Western culture is what we would call we would usually call the high culture, so the literary tradition, poetry, and these sort of things. But then on the other hand is gangster rap, for example, not a thoroughly Western culture, right? So there's a problem with this idea of creating a kind of indigenous Western cultural Islam, because inevitably anyone who speaks about kind of forging this cultural Western Islam inevitably is selecting a particular version of Western culture, and that's actually what some of these scholars do quite openly, right? So some of them quite openly align themselves with sort of more conservative elements that are usually found on the sort of right-wing end of the political spectrum. Now, another problem that I see with this creating or kind of forging or engineering a Western cultural Islam is the fact that, well, a community based on that could very easily be as exclusivist as the sort of cultural communities of, well, cultural meaning the back home communities, if you like. And there have actually been some projects of sort of convert-based communities here in the UK, in Spain, and maybe some of you have seen a documentary that Ahlul Bayt TV once produced called La Moulinée. It was about a small French convert community, right, which was absolutely fascinating. And to me, as a convert, seeing that they actually kind of built a community, was quite impressive. But then I thought, well, there's a bit of an issue there, that because the only people this community actually attracts are converts, right? There's not a single non-convert in that space, right? Which is obviously not ideal. And the last issue that I see is that this kind of discourse of localizing or indigenizing Islam is very often used in what is often called the good Muslim and bad Muslim game, right? Where the indigenized, if you like, kind of local, our Muslims who are kind of well integrated in our culture are the good ones, and all the rest are potential radicals and extremists, right? And we see this kind of good Muslim, bad Muslim game in quite a few places, right? I know that, for example, the sort of Indian Hindu nationalism really uses that trope, right? Where we have our nice kind of integrated Muslims, and we have the Arabized ones, which are the bad ones. But even in my home country of Poland, we have a small group of Muslims who have actually been there for the last 600 years, right? They're called the Tatars. And historically, because obviously they live in a post-Soviet country, so they've gone through this period where they had sort of forced, kind of state-forced attempt to completely eradicate religion. Most of them today are very secularized. Absolute majority of them kind of hardly practice any Islam at all. And so this is considered the good Polish Islam, right? Which is kind of contrasted with the bad Islam of the bad immigrants, the bad Arabs, and their evil convert sidekicks, right? So this game is kind of being played out actually quite often. And so just to kind of finish, I want to now come to a few Shaykhs of convert background within our Shia tradition, right? We do have a few. Probably not heard of any of them, right? Because they're not kind of international figures. They're not even kind of operate in this sort of English for English-speaking audiences. They kind of operate within their particular countries, right? But just to name a few that I kind of known and have kind of interacted with on some level, and so I was able to speak to them about this topic and kind of get their opinions on it. So there's a person called Sheikh in my country, Poland, quite a remarkable figure. He's in his 80s, but converted to Islam in his 20s. So he's been Muslim for longer than most of us live. There's Sheikh Abbas Di Palma of Italy. He's graduated from the house of Qom, and he now leads a Shia center in Rome. There is Sheikh Raúl González Bornes of Spain, again, a graduate of Qom, and he's translated the Quran into Spanish. There's Sheikh Anton Vesnin of Russia. So we do have quite a few of them, right? We don't really know about them, but they operate in their own countries, and they're usually quite prominent figures within their Muslim communities there. And those of them that I did kind of get to speak to about this particular topic seem to be kind of in agreement in terms of the fact that, yes, we do find that there is a lot of these kind of, there's too much of these sort of cultural kind of Islam within our communities. Yes, that's not a good thing. But none of them actually propose a indigenous Western Islam. None of them propose, for example, a Italian Islam or a Spanish Islam. So what they seem to be kind of in agreement with is that the way kind of forward would be to just de-emphasize the role of these cultures simply by just emphasizing Islam, and also by making some real efforts in terms of increasing the diversity of the communities. Right? And so their idea usually is that once you make that effort and you really introduce a lot of diversity in your community, and you de-emphasize whichever kind of culture of origin that kind of dominates in a particular community, then inevitably it will just lead to something completely different. It will kind of deculturalize that space, if you like, and as long as the Islam that is being promoted there is kind of healthy, wholesome, kind of holistic, and wise, then the kind of cultural superstructure that this community will generate, as long as it's quite diverse, can be expected to be healthy, wholesome, holistic, etc. Right? So that's, I think that's it. I would really welcome any comments, criticism, heckling or whatever, because obviously being a convert myself, I probably have a very particular perspective on this, and I would really love to hear yours. So thank you. Oh, actually, one more thing that I forgot, and this might actually be the most important thing you will hear from me tonight. So whatever you think about this sort of indigenization process, whatever you do, please do not indigenize Nias. Okay, please do that for me. I don't want to have bangers and mash at the mosque. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any questions from either side?
Thank you very much, Shakari, for these reflections. Two things. One is that within the fiqh, as you hinted, there has been some discussion of Muslims living in non-Muslim countries or migrating to non-Muslim countries. So originally, of course, this was considered to be Darul Harb. And Either you were trapped there or you were forced to live there. I think Tariq Ramadan developed a whole genre of thought saying that this is Darul Aman, that it gives you sanctuary against your own societies where you are in trouble. Of course, that doesn't apply to converts at all. But I think there is a good space there for developing the fiqh, so you can actively participate in these societies rather than feel that I'm going back home, I'm going back home. Okay? The other one is that I mean, people like Abdullah Quillam, Martin Lings, Guy Eaton, and so on, who have contributed quite a lot in showing what can be achieved within indigenous culture. So I think even those communities which you refer to as back home communities need to work with them to figure out how to find this space here and develop further so more people will be attracted to Islam. You think this is possible?
Yeah, I think that was the point of the Shia Shaykhs were actually making, and I do agree with that, right? That the key is actually this diversity. So actually you bring all these people together, right? And something good will come out of it. Because obviously when you have diversity, then inevitably, right, there's not one culture that will kind of dominate that, right? And like that's the case with people from mixed backgrounds, right? They don't tend to be kind of very hung up on either culture because, you know, they were not really brought up in one. You know, my kids are of mixed heritage. Their mom's Pakistani, I'm Polish. They're not going to consider themselves either Pakistani or Polish, right? So when you have a community that's kind of very diverse, then quite naturally there is not going to be one culture that sort of dominates the thing. Right? And yeah, those projects that you've mentioned, like Abdullah Quillam, I think the issue was the fact that they only tend to attract, this is a historical community, by the way, it doesn't exist anymore, but they only tended to attract other converts. And so, yeah, I mean, they just died out.
Assalamu alaikum. Very warm welcome and thank you for making the time. This is fascinating. I've got 3 questions for you. 2 on localization and 1 around sort of existing mosques in their own culture. So on localization, is it a point in time where we have historically, for example, and you know, you gave the example of China or even Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran or Russia, is it a point in time where that localization begins to take place because of the sheer numbers of converts? And a linked question to that is, have there been any studies on the ways in which localization successfully worked? Because of course we do see examples now, though there are hundreds of years, if not more, where it had taken place, but you know, we find poetry and so on, where it's, you know, truly immersed in that culture. So these are the 2 questions. And if I may, now that I've got the microphone, a question to, you know, around mosques like this one. What would you say the 3 most important things that would make you, as a convert, belong? Thank you.
So, I mean, it's obviously a very gradual process. Right? I mean, in many cases where Islam actually spread, it would first sort of conquer a particular land, and often what the Muslim armies would do, they would actually establish like a garrison town outside the kind of conquered land, and they would not even interact much with the conquered people. They just kind of left them be. As long as you know pay jizya, it's fine, right? So they were not really making much attempts to convert people, etc. So it was a gradual kind of sort of organic process that would usually take quite a long time. But I think the kind of the point at which it usually really kind of accelerated with people kind of accepting Islam was usually or at least often, it was this sort of missionary work of Sufis, right? So I mean, whenever they went, they would, they would try and be kind of best examples of, the teachings of Islam, right? And obviously, being very spiritual people, that kind of attracted people about them. They've seen them and they said, well, I mean, this is an amazing person. Their ethics and their kind of the way they carry themselves, whatever religion they're following, I want in on that, right? So I find kind of historically that was usually the point at which this sort of localizing really kind of accelerated, because lots and lots of local people kind of started organically becoming Muslims. What would make me kind of feel a bit more welcome? Well, I have to say, I don't think I've ever been made sort of particularly unwelcome in any mosque. So, I would say that just treat a convert, if there ever is one in your community, just pretty much just like anybody else, right? I think often converts are either sort of put on the pedestal, right? And, we do the whole, mashallah, you're converted, right? And then, or they are somewhere kind of in the corner of the mosque and no one really speaks to them because no one knows them. They haven't really got any social ties there, right? So I mean, just treat them like anybody else. And I think that's really what most converts really want. They just want to be treated just as everybody else.
Last question, and then we'll have to end for Adhan and Maghrib.
Interesting talk, but I would like now to ask you a personal question.
Sure.
How did you yourself become a Muslim? How did you become interested in Islam?
Okay. So very briefly, I was kind of brought up in a family that was sort of nominally Christian, but almost completely not religious. Right? So growing up, religion was really just not part of my life at all. I wasn't taught any religion. So when I got to the age of kind of 16 and I started having, the kind of big questions about life and the purpose of life, etc., I felt that I have like a clean slate. I don't really have to find religious answers in Christianity just because I'm, I live in a Christian country, right? So I just started exploring religions in general. And at the age of 18, I decided that Islam was the one, right? And it was Shia Islam specifically, right? So I didn't go from Sunnism to Shiism at some point, which is kind of the usual sort of course. So yeah, very briefly, that's my story. There's nothing in my story that's sort of there was no eureka moment. There was no kind of enlightenment. I didn't have a divine dream or anything like that. It's a very boring story. I know. I just read lots of books and I decided, yeah, this is it.
In that age, how could you decide that Islam and Shiism in particular is the best route for you? In fact, that's not easy.
Thank you very much. I know that there are other people who probably want to ask questions, but it's time for Maghrib, so inshallah, Shaykh will be around afterwards if you have any questions. But we'll end. So please can you end the salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And just before Adhan, if your children are in the other hall, please do collect them before prayers.
إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر ولله الحمد. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن عليًا ولي الله أشهد أن عليًا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وسلم.
Just another announcement, if anyone's children are next door, please do pick them up. They shouldn't be left by themselves otherwise. Thank you.
محمد رسول الله محمد رسول الله علي ولي الله